And we're live.
Hello, hello,
Hey,
hello. Hi, Rick.
Hi.
How are
Hello.
you? Hi, Reshie. Welcome to an honest look.
good morning, Reshie.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon
Good
for both
afternoon.
of us, right? For both of us. Well, I want to go ahead and, as you can see, we have a guest here with us. I want to go ahead and introduce him to you properly. Welcome to the show, Reshie. Reshie
Thank you.
Joseph is a former doctor who is now a counseling psychologist specializing in the treatment of trauma, PTSD, addictions, and related disorders. Reshie has worked in various settings, including the criminal justice system in Singapore and private rehabilitation centers, treating a range of serious psychiatric illnesses and severe personality and behavioral disorders. He also teaches psychology and is the author of the book, A Beginner's Guide to Trauma. And I'm going to let him get a little bit deeper into all of that. But we're going to start with welcoming you. We've been waiting for this conversation. Very excited to dive a little
Mhm.
deeper into this. It's such a relevant conversation to mental health, to frankly everyone's life to some degree or
Mm.
another. And then I'm just gonna ask you to maybe start by telling us a little bit how you got here. I know Rick had a question right before we came on the air, so I'm gonna let him ask that question. But welcome to an honest look, Reshie.
Yeah. Uh,
Well, thank you both. Sorry, Rick, you were about to say something?
well, yeah. No. Well, I get. It's not an elephant in the room, but one of the things that really caught my attention in your bio was the word former,
Mm.
and and my understanding of being a doctor is once you're a doctor you're always a doctor, and I'm curious
Yeah.
if you want to speak about it, like what is this notion about being a former doctor as opposed to not really telling us or labeling yourself as such. And then I really want to
Well,
hear your backstory. Sorry.
yes. Well, let me begin by saying thank you to you both. Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Fatty, for having me on your podcast to discuss what I consider to be probably the most salient topic in mental health, if not in all of health. That we face today, certainly in the field. And to begin by answering that sort of slightly scandalous question, if I can phrase it that way, you know, ex-doctor, what did he do to deserve that? Well, I think perhaps a more accurate way to have described myself would be to say one who is no longer practicing. So you once you acquire the title, it's an honorific. It follows you whether you're practicing or not. It follows you after you've retired. It's a bit like being, oh, I don't know, an army captain or an army major. I would imagine it's the same in the US and certainly in England. If somebody has attained a certain rank, they're always referred to even after they've been retired. Which could be half their life. They're still referred to as Major so and so or Commander so and so. For the rest of their lives. So it's an honorific in that sense. But I think the distinction that I try and make, and this is where the value in it is really only from a clinical perspective, it's really so that people know at first introduction exactly what it is that I do on a clinical basis. And this, for me, is where it's important to draw the distinction between someone who's in medical practice and someone who's in psychological or counseling practice, which I'm in. And so that's the reason why I'm at pains to draw the distinction, because I don't practice medicine, certainly not in the way that most people in the West would understand it. So that's the reason why. I hope that
Right.
answers your question. And I
Yeah.
think
No.
if I could also say something else, it's something important because the conversations that I'm engaged in, one of the preconditions for progress is the breaking down of barriers that really shouldn't be there. And as long as there's undue deference shown to people like myself, those barriers cannot come down. So I'm all for taking out words where they don't belong, and certainly this is one, if I can phrase it that way.
Hmm. No, that's powerful. Like I really appreciate that. I mean, sometimes labels do get in the way.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. I've had a lot of these conversations, and you'd be surprised. Um, I know we spoke about this, before we came on air, and I sort of um, rather blithely joked about, jam one word in where it doesn't belong, and suddenly I was on a panel recently, and the host of the panel, it was a live broadcast like this one, just purely out of respect. It wasn't done in a malicious way, but I was sitting on a panel with other people, and as soon as she jammed the word doctor in there, everybody on the panel changed. Suddenly everyone minded that, I don't want to be part of those discussions. There's no use to them. There's no point to them. I want discussions where people really bring what they actually think. And if they think that my industry is rubbish, I want them to say so. I want them to feel like they're able to say so. And if you jam one word where it doesn't belong, changes the whole thing.
Yeah.
And if we can follow that trope, I mean, I'm mindful of the fact that I'm speaking to an American audience. If we think about jamming a word in where it doesn't belong, I'm thinking specifically about the US Pledge of Allegiance, which, if you look at it in its original format, does not have the words under God at the end of it. If you actually look at the history, the original Pledge of Allegiance doesn't have that, it doesn't have those two words. But I believe it was during the McCarthy era when someone noticed that this pledge could be said by a communist child in Beijing or in Moscow, word for word. And so all the committees were erected, and it's like, well, how can we make it such that a communist child in Bulgaria or in Moscow or in Beijing couldn't possibly say this pledge? Jam two words in where they don't belong, break up the flow of the whole thing, and suddenly you've got, et voila, there you go. So I'm sorry, in my own defense, it's 4 o'clock in the morning and these thoughts come.
No, it's great. No, I appreciate that. And to get you back on track, you're right about the trauma. And we're both really curious about your beginnings of, like I know
Yeah.
you got into the medical field and somehow move towards the psychology of it all. So I'm interested in the backstory of that.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll launch into my narrative, I guess. I mean, I don't really need to say a great deal about my childhood. I mean, anyone knows that to get into med school, you have to do reasonably well. You have to be fairly bright as a kid. You have to get good grades and all the rest of it, which I did, and got into med school. The only thing I would say about my childhood is that the only thing about that is that it can be, and it was in my case, it can be a mask. It can be a red herring, if you like, that everything with the kid is fine when actually it's not. I know this because I discovered a trove of my old report cards, my elderly mum's residence, and I went through them. And they were very interesting reading because it was as though my parents only read the first half of them. Because if you read the first half and ignored the second half, you could be fooled into thinking that I was doing perfectly well. Because the first half were just the grades, and they were very good. But the second half, if you actually went into what the teachers and the schoolmasters and the schoolmistresses were observing, well, that was a different story. And when I read those, you can see in there clues of the trouble that was to come. So anyway, I went to med school and I had a shining career as a surgeon or a physician ahead of me, graduated med school and started working. And to cut a long story short, that's where unresolved trauma, if I call it that for now, I'll go into what exactly that is or its definition perhaps later, the opportunity is afforded me. But a lot of unprocessed trauma eventually caught up with me, and I did not have the psychological defenses, the psychological resilience to weather that storm. And a storm it was, and when it did take hold of me, it completely obliterated me. And when I say obliterated, I mean by the time I was done 9 years later, I was a heroin and a crack cocaine addict living on the streets with my title, uh, which is why I drop it. It really was meaningless in that when you are living on the streets, those titles mean nothing. They really don't, you know. But yeah, so I got sober in 2011, got clean off street drugs and alcohol and everything else in 2011. But there was one question that I always wanted answered, which was, why me? Now, I know all of us who are in recovery do ask that question. Everyone would. You know, I come from a family of X number of brothers and sisters. They're not alcoholics, they're not addicts. Why did I become one? So everyone has that question. But I think in my case, it was particularly pressing because when I
Yeah.
looked at all of my peers in the fellowship, none of them came from the same, you know, background that I did. They didn't come from broken homes. They didn't come from uh, you know, blighted inner cities. They didn't come from housing projects. They didn't come from council estates or inner city. You know, they didn't come from that. So I didn't come from that. I came from an upper middle class family. I had professional parents. I grew up in a home with books and, you know,
Mhm.
music and all of that. So the question was, how did this happen? And it was when I was 18, about 18 months clean, 18 months sober, when I stumbled in my own therapy across trauma. And then a light bulb went on. And that was when I realized how trauma was really central to the story of my addiction. And as I explored further and learned further, I began to realize how central it was to the experience of every addict that I knew. And it really is a central tenet of addiction, period. And then beginning to explore further as I got further along in recovery, I decided not to go back to practicing medicine. I decided to stay in this field permanently because it really moved and excited me. After all, the most interesting thing to me is me, and you know this was my story, so I had no trouble exploring it. And that's really where the journey into trauma um, began, and I'm still on that journey. I'm still learning. I'm still educating myself, but I've come far enough now to pay it forward, pass it forward, to begin to uh, I don't want to say educate others because it sounds very pretentious, but to share the knowledge, if I can put it that way, to share the knowledge because I see so many other people who are blighted by this, both in my clinical practice as well as in a more general sense. And I always say to myself, if they only knew how simple the answer was, it could be life changing, as it was for me, and as is and was for so many people, so many others. I hope that that answers the question succinctly.
Yes, thank you so much. That's I loved actually hearing this backstory and how you got into that. And I would actually love to dive a little bit deeper into what you just spoke to, how simple this is, maybe like help us break down a little bit trauma, complex trauma, make that distinction, wherever you feel like it's
Yeah.
relevant, so to help the audience understand this topic a little bit better.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question because one of the questions that I've been asked quite a lot, and certainly by my colleagues, is that there are many excellent books out there on trauma. Why did you feel it necessary to add another one? Right.
Mm.
And the honest answer is that there are many fantastic people out there talking about trauma. You know, people like Gabor Mate, people like Bessel van der Kolk, who've written the two best known books on trauma. But what I find with them is they don't answer the question in language that is accessible. They have a tendency to stray into clinical language or ephemeral language. You know, for example, one of the things that Mate is quoted as saying is that, you know, trauma is a disconnection from the self. Now, I
Mhm.
know what that means, and I'm willing to wager that you both know what that means. But if you said that to the man on the street, if you say, look, it's very important for you to know about the subject, and he says, or she says, why? And you say to them, well, because, you know, if you're suffering from it, it's a disconnection from yourself. I've tried it. You may as well be speaking Greek or Chinese. You know, people will just look at you very strangely, like, was this a religious thing? You know, When in actual fact, it isn't. It's much, much simpler than that. Now, they do say it, but it's lost in all of this language, and I think maybe it's one of the pains of growing. It's one of the you know one of the things that one sacrifices when one grows is that one begins to look at one's heroes through a different lens. They don't appear quite so shiny and perfect as they did certainly when I began this journey. You begin to see flaws in what they're saying. So what I wanted to do was to, it's an English way of framing things, was to put something out there that does exactly what it says on the tin. Nothing more, nothing less. Just, if it's a tin, strip away all the advertising, strip away all of the euphemistic statements about disconnecting from the self, and just put on it baked beans, or diced tomatoes. It's just exactly what it is, and nothing more and nothing less, which is why I wrote the book. So as to a definition of trauma, well, the word itself tells you what it is. The word trauma comes from the ancient Greek word traumatikos, which simply means wound, injury. That's what it means. And the interesting thing is that the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, all cultures, in fact, never distinguished between the injury of the mind and the injury of the body. If you went to Hippocrates, or if you went to Asclepiades, whom I talk about at length in the beginning of the book, if you went to Galen in ancient Rome, and you'd broken your leg, they would be asking you questions about your diet. They'd be asking you questions about your social life. They'd be asking you questions about your marriage. It was considered normal because what they fundamentally understood, which we lost 350 years ago with the advent of Descartes, was that the mind and the body were intimately connected, and you could not separate one from the other. To injure the body is to injure the mind, and vice versa. And that is this interconnectedness. And it wasn't until Descartes came along with his famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, that we have the beginnings of Cartesian mind-body dualism. And of course, the succeeding generations of medical practitioners have built on that. And if you go to a doctor today with a broken leg or with an infection or with a kidney that hurts, they're not going to ask you about what's happening in your life or how your relationships are, or questions that are absolutely central to a person's well-being. Because if you're carrying an injury in that aspect of your life, it's going to affect everything from your capacity to recover from any kind of physical injury to your ability to stick to the script if you want. And that's the reason why I think this conversation is so salient, because we've understood, and through the process of biomedical reductionism, we've gone ever smaller into molecular genetics and into biological medicines at the histological level, at the molecular level. We're getting smaller and smaller and smaller reductionism. But what we're missing is a big picture, and the big picture is there. Because in 1977, we had a guy come along and said, look, the model we're working from is wrong, because the model we're working from does not take into account a human being's mental state, doesn't take into account their sociology, their social environment, doesn't take these two critical factors into account. And to treat only a person's biology, right, to only look at them as biological, mechanical organisms, is to miss 2/3 of what makes a person healthy. And if a person is suffering with injuries in these two domains, they're not going to recover in the third, or they're going to be compromised in the third. And we've had so much research from the medical community itself that confirms this. Just research after research. I mean, I don't want to get overly technical, but if you wish me to, I can quote papers, research papers from my profession that confirms this.
Yeah.
Very few of them get published, because to get published in a reputable journal, your numbers have to make sense. So if you have, like, for example, one paper that I saw recently, effect sizes that when you multiply them don't add up. Well, they don't add up if you're only looking at one of the three components, but when you factor in the other two, of course they do. So, sorry, slightly long-winded answer, but I don't know if that answers your questions. Your question,
No,
Fatih.
it does, because so much of what we as coaches, um, we work from the inside out in the sense of from a holistic aspect of it. When I look at even our current, like where I live right now, drug overdoses are one of the biggest things, and gay bars out in my community too. And and he often speaks about getting to the source, because what we're doing is we're really treating symptoms, because they're so easy, because they're so identifiable, right? We see them. Well, they're sitting on the street, they're homeless. Okay, so let's give them homes. Kind of a thing. Like and now we want to give them drugs, because safe
Yeah.
drugs, because they're killing themselves with fentanyl. They're all symptom based. There's two things. I'm interested in what you believe is the source, and the other thing is you mentioned somebody in 1977, but you didn't mention his name. Where, like, I'm curious.
His name is George Engel.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a psychiatrist. It's not what he's most famous for, interestingly enough, but he
Okay.
has become very, very famous for this because he's being retrospectively discovered. But I don't think he's given a name to the model. He calls it the biopsychosocial model. But really, he's talking about ancient wisdom that we've had going back thousands of years. If you look at, as I have, at ancient medical records coming out of, they're digging up from Pompeii and Herculaneum and places like this, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient China, ancient India, the Ayurvedic tradition, all the different traditions, the Inca tradition. This is not something new,
Mm,
Rick.
yeah.
This is not some, earth-shattering discovery. We've known this for thousands of years. But what started 350 years ago that got massively accelerated with the Industrial Revolution, and people, one of the things that I'm in the middle of actually launching, this sort of takes us off on a tangent, is something we don't have a name for it yet, but I call it Engels Superman. This is my sort of working title for this, and my colleagues, they keep telling me we have to come up for a different name because first of all, nobody knows who George Engel is, and the word Superman, to apply for because the theory being that if you look at the whole of human history, the whole history of Homo sapiens going back 270,000 years, that identifiably we've gone from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, right? That we've been on the planet, and you average out the lifespan over the last 270,000 years, it works out to about 43. For most of our history, we didn't live past 35.
Mm.
And it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we even reached 50. It wasn't until the 20th century that medicine took hold in a way where suddenly people were living past 50 in a consistent way. So really, life expectancy, if you want to look at it through that lens, should have ended for all of us by now. Certainly for you and I, Rick. I don't know about
Yeah.
the very fair lady sitting over there. I'm sure
Yeah.
she's not a day
Good
over
catch.
21,
Good catch,
but
Reshie.
you know, good staying. But apart from the lovely 21-year-old lady or 22-year-old lady, if she's a day over that, sitting at the table, us two old chaps, Rick, we should have shuffled off this mortal coil by now if our forebears were to go by it. So we're finding that more and more, we talk about men having a midlife crisis. Not a midlife crisis, it's an afterlife crisis because we're not supposed to be alive. What
Oh,
do men do
cool.
after 50? Well, they don't know because we weren't supposed to live this long, and that's why we call it Engels Superman, because it's not about a midlife, it's about a new life. But anyway, that's a
Mm.
completely different subject. But
Oh, I
his name
love
is
that.
George Engel.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll have to look him up, and but that's brilliant. Like, oh wow, I could see you might have to come back. And we'll talk about George.
Engels Superman.
Yeah, Superman. Yeah, no.
So what
Mm.
have you? What was the first question that you asked, Rick?
About the source,
Oh,
like if 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 modern methods or procedures right now are only really focusing symptomatically, trying to address the symptoms, Where do we go?
Well, that's a brilliant question, and that's really just getting straight to the heart of the chase. Um, and I think I addressed this, slightly controversially in the book. I ask a very salient question, which is, are the Sackler family responsible for the opioid crisis in America? I think most people would say yes. Well, I argue that they're not responsible for it in the sense that they are not the source of it. They certainly, I'm not trying to give them a free pass here because Purdue and that lot have certainly taken a bad problem and made it infinitely worse. They're not giving them a free pass in any way whatsoever. But to say that they are the cause of it is to misunderstand what causes addiction in the first place. Now, how do I know this? How do I know this? I don't just know this on a professional level. I know this on a personal level because
Mm,
all the junk that they're putting out on the streets has been there since year dot, was there when I was on the street. There was fentanyl all over the place. There was oxycodone all over the place. It was all there. So why wasn't there an opioid epidemic then? This stuff has been available for eons. I worked on a pediatric oncology. I've worked on oncology wards. There's the massive vials of morphine everywhere. So why isn't, if availability or if simply taking the substance is the reason why people are getting addicted, people have been treated with diacetyl morphine, which is the chemical formula for heroin. They've been treated with it, treating cancer with it, treating surgery with it. Thousands, millions of people every day for decades have been treated. Why aren't all those people addicts? The
mm,
reasoning doesn't stand up to closer scrutiny. The answer is that the conditions for creating addicts simply weren't there. And once the conditions were there, the addicts appeared.
Right.
It's not availability. This stuff has been available on the streets, easily available on the streets since I was there, before I was there, and since I've gone.
yeah.
No change, I'm afraid, to the people who say, "Oh, they put this crap out on the street." I'm sorry, it was there when I was there. But people were not shooting this stuff up, and they certainly weren't killing themselves when I was there because they did not feel the need.
Right.
People will, I mean, ask yourself, what do these substances do? What
Right.
do opioids do? They're painkillers. Why do people take painkillers? They take painkillers because they're in pain.
Right.
That's
Mm,
why they take them. A person who isn't in pain, and this is where George Engel's model comes from. If you only look at physical pain, it doesn't make any sense because they don't have broken limbs, they don't have cancer, they haven't had surgery. Where's the pain coming from?
mhm.
But if you understand that psychological pain is registered, this is an interesting fact. Psychological pain or emotional pain, if you want to be more exact, the brain does not distinguish between the two. If you look at the sensory cortex that registers pain in the brain, it's exactly the same part of the brain. The neurochemical pathways are exactly the same. The neurons are exactly the same. The brain doesn't distinguish between emotional pain and physical pain. Pain is just pain. So, I think it was Gabor I think, who asked this, or Bessel van der Kolk, one of those two, or maybe Stephen Porges, who says this. He says, really, the question we should be asking is not why these people, stuffing handfuls of opioids down their throat. The question we really need to be asking is why are so many people in pain?
Right.
Why are
Right.
so many people in pain? Because only people in pain take painkillers. I know I've given morphine myself as a physician. I've given morphine to I don't know how many people. None of them became addicts. None of
Right.
them did.
So,
I
so
worked
what
in a
would
ward with 24 other doctors. I'm the only one who availed myself of the plentiful supply of substances. The 23, if I can phrase it politely, the 23 others didn't. If it was simply availability, well, all 24 of us should have ended up as addicts, but only
Mm,
one did, me.
yeah.
so based on your experience then, where does this what is this where does that addiction come from, and like what is that pain, where is that pain coming from?
Yeah, well, I think you answered the first part of your own question very brilliantly. Where does addiction come from? Addiction comes from pain. It comes
Right.
from the experience of pain that the person is unable to soothe, that
Right.
they don't have the capacity to soothe, to internally soothe. So they have to soothe it with external means.
Right.
And the one that's getting all of the headlines is opioids. But if you were writing 10 years ago, it would have been methamphetamine. If you were writing 10 years before that, it would have been crack. You know, I'm old enough to say I was a crack addict. That's how long ago it was. You know, it takes an effort to remember. But, you know, I remember Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan saying, and George Bush the elder saying, you know, from the White House holding a little packet of crack, worst crack I've ever seen. But anyway, he was holding it and he was saying, this is killing American children. You know, the story is the same. The substance changed, but the story goes back as long as Richard Nixon and before him. He was the one who started the war on drugs. You know, so that's the first answer. The answer to the first part of your question. Where's the you know where does addiction come from? It comes from it's a pathological means of soothing pain, if you want to think of it that way. And the second part of the question, if I'm not mistaken, was why are so many people in pain? That's the slightly more difficult question to answer. And that's where we really have to look at how people are being treated, the lives they're leading, to look at them as tripartite organisms, to look at them not just as biological organisms, but as sociological ones and as psychological ones, and look at where the stresses are in those two uh, domains. I mean, just as an illustration as to why these two domains are so important, this is a study that I think it's Christine Coulter who quotes this study quite often. It's an Australian study that looked at cancer in the Australian outback. I believe the Australian federal government had spent millions and millions and millions of dollars because they had very good medical services in the cities, but in the Australian outback, a bit like being in the Midwest, I think in America, in I don't know, Utah or somewhere. But unlike America, a lot of the places, you know, the rural places in Australia, this is going back some years now, did not have very good medical services. So the Australian government paid doctors, people like myself. In fact, I remember at the time the Australian government were paying ridiculous amounts of money to pilfer doctors from the National Health Service in England where I trained and fly them over. And as long as we were willing to go work in the outback in in the rural townships for a while before we could get a nice plush job in Sydney or in Melbourne. Um, And so they did, but it was a colossal failure, huge amounts of money. And so they wanted to know why. So they sent this crack team of professors, to do a research project. And they crafted a brilliant, brilliant study where they really took Engels' philosophy to heart, certainly his model, and along with all of the biological questions, and looking at water quality and air quality and all those biological, they also talk about putting questions in where they don't belong. These two questions really upset the apple cart. The first question was really about emotional stability, and they asked the women if they felt emotionally repressed, particularly if they felt emotions that were on the negative scale. So things like anger, rage, all of anxiety, right? All of those negative affects, as we call them. Did they feel that those were repressed, or did they feel that they could express them? That was the first question. The second question was really about their social environment, which was about whether they felt supported by the people in their community, by their families, etc., etc. And the women who answered yes, but to either question, but no to the second, had no different rate. But the women who answered yes to both questions shared the same air quality, the same food, the same drinking water, every biological marker was exactly the same. But if they answered yes to feeling emotionally repressed and yes to feeling unsupported, their cancer rates were something like 9 times higher.
Wow.
Wow.
And initially, they had real trouble publishing the study because, according to our system, an effect size of 0 multiplied by effect size of 0 cannot give you 9. You see the problem? How do you, you'll get laughed at in the scientific community. No peer-reviewed journal will publish that. So they had real trouble with that. But they eventually got it published and couldn't explain it. Well, there is an explanation for it, as if you're willing to look past the purely biological aspects of cancer and take on board the possibility that prolonged psychological distress and prolonged sociological distress, when combined, can cause something as deadly as cancer. Then, of course, in 1998, the great American physician who worked for Kaiser Permanente, both of you will know this, certainly. Vince Folletti and Bob Ander published probably the most important medical study in the last 50 years, the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And right there in the data was proof that there was a link between trauma and not just cancer, but heart disease, metabolic syndrome, diabetes. In fact, there was a dose-response relationship between the amount of trauma a person suffered and the amount of illness they were going to go on and develop. Dose response, meaning the higher the dose, the higher the chance there was. And it's fantastic. And see, it's data like that became very explanatory. Going back to the original question that I asked myself, how could it possibly happen to me? Well, look at the statistics of the ACE study. If you have 7 ACEs or more, the chances of you becoming not just any addict, but an intravenous drug addict, they were very specific, an intravenous IV using drug addict is 4,700% higher if you have 7 ACEs. And guess how many ACEs I have? 7. That's how accurate this study is. That's how mind-blowingly accurate this study is, and why it was so life-changing. Because right there in the data is the answer.
Right. That's
so why, like, we're not talking about, like, this isn't like you even quoted like 1999 and various, like, I know this is coming up in the surface, like we're talking about this a lot more, particularly in the field. I reside in the emergency response field with like emergency services like police, fire. I was a paramedic for 30 years. We never talked about burnout. We never talked about the stress of the work and things like that. But what I noticed though is the work was the work, and everybody had different experiences about the work. But we keep pointing back towards the work is causing the stress. The work is causing all these different things. But I'm saying it can't be true, or there would be, like you were pointing out earlier, more people would be falling apart.
Yeah.
So it really
exactly.
can't be the work.
Yeah.
But we keep pointing to that. So how can we make this shift, Reshie? How can we turn the turntables on this one?
Well, let's start with the obvious, and then we'll move on to the less obvious, right?
Okay.
So I always find it's a good way to do it this way. So if you have a stressful job, say you're CEO of a company, or any job in this day and age is stressful. Okay? If you have a stressful job, if you're physically healthy, you have good physical health, you get enough sleep, you eat well, you drink well, you take regular exercise, etc., you are going to be able to deal with the stress of the job much, much better than someone who is diabetic with heart disease and all the various different things. Now that has to be obvious to anyone. Extend that thinking to a person's psychology and to a person's sociology. If a person is emotionally well, if they're emotionally healthy, they have good relationships, they can self-soothe, etc., the mechanisms are there. They will, just like a person who's physically healthy, they will be optimized to deal with whatever stress that comes by. And I mean, you mentioned police, right? One of the things that I do know about police, having worked in the criminal justice system, is that they spend a great deal of time bonding. People in emergency departments very often do. I certainly remember we did this as doctors, nurses do this, firefighters, policemen, all across the board. Why? Why is it an integral part? It's like everyone goes to the same bar, everyone goes to the same place, and it's because of the impact it has on the environment. It's because the impact that it has on a person's sociological health, because that sense of feeling supported, of being part. It's the reason why Alcoholics Anonymous is so successful, because or Narcotics Anonymous, if you take people who are complete losers like myself, right, total down and out people, and suddenly you fashion them to be part of a winning team, that is life-changing. And that's what the 12-step relationship does. It takes people that are completely broken, who have nothing, who are nothing, and it says, come on board and be part of this winning team. Just by doing that, you've taken care of 1/3 of their health needs. 1/3 of your health needs are taken care of. You just got to worry about the other 2. And if you happen to have a good sponsor, that's 2/3. Now you just got to think about living healthy, which means not drinking 30 cups of coffee and smoking 40 cigarettes every day, which all of us do when we first come into recovery. That seems to be the last bit that we give up, but give up we do.
Wow.
And then you've got all 3.
I was wondering if you could get a little bit more into, trauma is such a complex conversation. Well, first of all, we mentioned complex trauma in our title. I wonder if you could go a little bit into that, and also a little bit into why is it so difficult for people to overcome trauma? Like, there's different levels of it, right? PTSD obviously is not like a minor traumatic event. It gets treated differently. So I wonder if you can just make those distinctions and get a little bit deeper into what that is.
Well, I mean, trauma as a concept has been around since ancient Greece, but really the modern understanding of trauma began in the late 19th century with 3 individuals: Sigmund Freud, Jean Piaget, but the third, and a rather obscure neurologist who's actually very important to the story, a French neurologist, psychologist called Jean-Martin Charcot. And he was the first person to describe dissociation or dissociative states accurately. Didn't know the origin of the symptoms, but like many great clinicians across the years, across the centuries, he described the spectrum of symptoms that you see in a traumatized individual very accurately. And he was also the first person to make the critical breakthrough in the modern age of medicine, which was to attribute the symptoms to a psychological, a neurological, and an emotional cause, and not the cause that it was thought. I mean, trauma, the old name for trauma was called hysteria. It was only thought to affect women, not men. And the reason they thought that, the name gives you a clue: hysteria. And the way they treated hysteria was with a hysterectomy. They believed that the symptoms of trauma came from a dysfunctional uterus, and that's why it only affected women. So we're talking about a time span of scarcely 150 years ago, where we as a profession still thought that men couldn't be traumatized, only women could, and that the way we treated them was to forcibly remove their uteri, which we did. And many, many women, I mean, when I think about that, I really don't want to think about that because it's just too horrific for even myself to contemplate. But that's, sorry?
I'm just going to say, like, I'm being a little light about this, but it explains why men shut their mouth up about trauma. knowing if that's the kind of aspect or treatment that we're going to go for, like, I'm not going to tell anybody that I'm having problems.
Also, it wasn't believed that men could have trauma, period.
Well, no, but I'm just saying, like, like if that was their go-to, I could just imagine, anyways, but sorry to interrupt you. I kind of went off on there, but
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. And that point has caused untold suffering for both men and for women. For women, it's obvious. I mean, you're ripping out one of their critical organs against their will,
yeah,
and
yeah.
they usually die on the operating theater as well. So it's an existential crisis for women, has been for a very long time. And this, I think, swells up into the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement is really about women not being believed, and you think that scarcely 100 years ago we were ripping out their uterus. I mean, it's not really difficult to understand why women are so angry.
Mhm.
I was in a Me Too panel once. That was very interesting, but that's a different story. uh, um, yeah, Me Too panel with fabulous psychologists, two women in the audience, and myself and another chap were the only males. But it's done a lot of disservice to men as well. Until this day, I don't know about America, but I certainly know this in England. There's a huge movement still in the country that a lot of boys I say boys, they were boys, 15, some of them, 15, 16. I mean, these were boys who were severely traumatized in the trenches, when they were under constant artillery bombardment for 6 solid days, 7 solid days, gas with chlorine gas, and they were running from the trenches screaming. Well, these boys were shot as cowards for running away, and there still exists within Britain a massive movement to have these young boys to have their honor restored because they were not cowards. They were just severely traumatized. And the thing is, the medical professionals at the time knew there was something wrong. They even had a term for it. They called it shell shock.
Mhm.
If a soldier had been under too much shelling, which is the code for artillery bombardment, if they've been shelled for too long, they would go into a kind of shock, which we now call PTSD. PTSD was formally included into the medical lexicon in 1980, which was really the result of just unbelievable. I mean, if you knew the details of this, you would realize just how unbelievable the work was done by psychologists, primarily in the United States Veterans Association, who studied men coming back from the Vietnam War. Vietnam War, we want to talk about opioids. There's a very interesting case study because we know that of the 250,000 men or more who came back from Vietnam, about 40% of them had a serious addiction to probably the finest heroin you can buy, which is in the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. Much better quality than the stuff you get from Pakistan or from Mexico. Right. So these were boys who were hooked on the best stuff you could get, the absolute best stuff you can get. And a year later, it had gone from 40% to under 10%. Within 5 years, that number was less than 3%. Where did all these addicts go? Where did they go? Right? So that's the current opioid crisis, but in reverse. So that is definitely worth studying. But it was their work really that formally forced the medical industry, the medical profession, to recognize post-traumatic stress disorder, which Christine Courtois rightly, I think, calls one of the signal breakthroughs, one of the proudest moments for our profession as a whole. And sadly, we have not, to answer your question, Fatih, why has this stuff not trickled down? Look, I spent 6 years in medical school. Do you know how many times I even heard the word trauma? Apart from in the context of the ER as a trauma surgeon, right? That was the only context you heard trauma, as a trauma, when you're working in trauma surgery. In terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and I spent plenty of months working in psychiatry, certainly spent plenty of time studying schizophrenia and bipolar and all the other disorders. Never heard the word trauma mentioned even once in 6 years of medical school. So to answer your question, Patty, is if the people who are supposed to be treating this stuff do not even hear it mentioned once, how does it trickle into society at large if the experts don't know it exists?
Mhm.
So what do you find that is effective in actually helping people navigate trauma and, overcome that, especially complex trauma like PTSD?
Yeah. Well, I think the zeitgeist has changed. I think streams of information have exploded since the advent of the internet and things like YouTube and Facebook and Instagram, and you know people are much, much more aware now. People are having conversations that they weren't having just 5 years ago or 10 years ago when I first entered this. Nobody knew anything. I remember when I first started doing this, asking my clinical supervisor at the time, saying to him, can you point me to a book that will just give me the lowdown on, the basic lowdown on this? There wasn't one. There was not one that could give me that. And so I just decided to write my own. But now with the advent of YouTube and the advent of certainly Instagram, I know this because it's a double-edged sword, because I have more and more people coming in to see me saying, I read this on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that can be problematic as well, because they come in with completely mixed up definitions of what it actually is. They come in and they'll very often say, they don't ask me what the problem is. They tell me what the problem is, what the diagnosis is, and how it should be treated. And that's a bit difficult, when you're having to do battle with Dr. Google and Dr. Instagram every day. But even so, but even so, I'll take it. I'll take it because at least people are having the conversations. And I have noticed that those conversations eventually reach a point of critical mass, right? A bit like a thermonuclear reaction, when
Mm-hmm.
enough hydrogen has been compressed and a chain reaction is set off and you can't stop it. It's going to go unless you insert graphite rods or something into it. The chain reaction has started, it's going to blow. You can't reverse it. It's a bit like that.
Yeah.
And the question, to answer your question, Patty, is whether that point of critical mass has been reached. I believe it has, because more people know about it now than don't know. They may not know exactly what they know, but they've certainly heard, and they're asking the right questions, and they're not taking the ignorance of their doctors as reasonable.
I
More and more.
I so some of my clients have been had the label or diagnosis of post-traumatic stress, and one of the things that I find disheartening is they're told that they're broken and that they would have to learn to live with it. In other words, it's a almost like a terminal illness to them, and that's how it's been, you know, communicated to them.
Yeah.
I know for my own fact that that's not true. Um,
Mm.
can you speak to that part about I know there's the feeling of brokenness, but
Mm.
but there is healing, there is light at the end of the tunnel. This isn't a terminal illness.
Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful topic to bring out. And I devote one chapter to this where I try to debunk this idea that there's no hope with the most rigorous science that I could find. And the most rigorous science I can find is actually the science of molecular genetics, that there are actually things in our genes that code for resilience that we can actually tap into. But anyway, I don't want to go into that. But
Mhm.
yes, to answer your question directly, I have seen people that I myself thought, as clients, that I thought were broken beyond my capacity to aid or to heal,
Right.
whichever way you want to call it. And what I would say are two things. Firstly, the clinician doesn't do any healing. I think it's an arrogance or that we award ourselves that is really incorrect. What we actually do is we create the conditions for the human nervous system to heal itself. That's really what we do, right? And the conditions are right. We don't have to do anything. The human body is unbelievable.
Yeah.
And that takes me to my second point, which is that I have seen people come back from the most unbelievable trauma. One of the highlights of 2023, apart from writing and publishing the book, was having the opportunity to work with women who had fled Afghanistan, who had to flee Afghanistan because they had collaborated with the US government and with other Western governments. And so they were on the Taliban hit list, right? If you want to look for a more terrified group of individuals, people at greater risks of trauma, you won't find. And I've seen the stories of these women and how they have come back will astonish you. So whoever is watching this who thinks themselves broken beyond repair, I would contradict that directly with the evidence of my own eyes, my own experience, both personal but very largely professional, people who I really thought were just damaged beyond belief.
Mm.
I am and continue to be surprised every day by the human capacity for healing, the nervous system's capacity to heal itself. I
Absolutely.
haven't yet seen someone that I really think to myself is beyond help. I'm just constantly surprised.
And what is that? Where is that healing start? On an emotional level, on by expressing it, by looking at it, working through the mind, through the body.
Well, I think it very often it's I write a great deal about shame. I quote a great deal from John Bradshaw, whom I consider to be the best writer on shame that there is. His beautiful book, Healing the Shame That Binds You, puts him in a different league, I think, who really described accurately. That's what, I describe shame as a prison created by the mind for the mind. It's the
Mm-hmm.
first breakthrough, to answer your question, Fatty. The first breakthrough, I think, is breaking out of that prison.
Right.
And very often, breaking out of that prison is simply picking up the phone and asking for help, you or picking up the name card of the therapist, the trauma therapist that your sister or your cousin pressed into your hand, whilst you were completely passed out from booze or drugs. And you wake
Right.
up and it's calling that number. In Alcoholics Anonymous, they use a phrase that I think is very, very beautifully summarizes that moment. And they call that moment the gift of desperation. You're so desperate, so completely broken that it's actually a gift because you don't have any more choices. Like myself, I didn't have any options. The only option is do that or die.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, it's a gift. I don't know if that answers your question, Fatima.
Yeah, so, sounds like it starts from really acknowledging it and removing what keeps us there, which is the shame, right? Keeps us from not only like sharing it, but it gets us into a whole other rabbit hole of feeling bad about it. And now you feel bad about the trauma that you have and you don't share it, you don't do anything about it, right? So it all starts with the
Yeah,
recognition, the acknowledgement that there's something there to look at. And there is something there to
yeah,
begin, right? Removing the shame and really looking at what it is that's creating the pain.
yeah. I think that's a really important point because one of the things certainly that kept me locked in that prison for a very long time, I think keeps a lot of people locked in that prison for a very long time, is this what CB cognitive behavioral therapists will call comparing and despairing. They compare themselves to war veterans or refugees, and they'll say to me, "Well, I'm not a refugee. I didn't grow up on the Waziristan Afghani border. I was not bullied by Pashtuns because I went to a refugee. I didn't experience any of those things. How can I possibly be traumatized?" And I'll often say to them, well, think about it this way. If you were waiting outside a supermarket to be picked up by someone, and that someone happens to be a couple of hours late, when they finally arrive after multiple calls that you've made and multiple attempts to get hold of them, you're likely to be very irritated or angry or both or
Mm-hmm.
resentful or somewhere on the negative affective spectrum. Now replace yourself with, say, a 4-year-old kid and ask yourself what it would be like to be a 4-year-old kid standing in the rain, in the sleeting cold rain, waiting for mommy to show up, and she doesn't. for 2 hours. Think about what will happen to that 4-year-old. You as an adult won't suffer any trauma, but when you contextualize it like that, any 4-year-old anywhere in the world, standing in the cold rain, I don't care if you're in Timbuktu or Afghanistan or in Boston, by the time mummy turns up, you are going to be, to borrow the old word, the hated word, hysterical. That's what you're going to be.
Right.
And then imagine that when mummy turns up, she's stressed because she can't pay the bills. She's just got into an argument with your dad about how they spend their money and how they're going to cover the rent. So they're already extremely stressed and they can't be present for a severely distressed child. You get into the car, she tries to comfort you and to hold the emotional space for you as best she can, but eventually she breaks. She can't hold it. And in a very unfortunate moment, she lashes out and backhands you, as many parents do every day around the world. That is where the trauma happens.
Right. Right. It's in the unprocessed experience, the emotional charge that it created with that
Yeah,
trauma, right, sits
it, it,
unresolved.
it really is, because children are one of the best books, I think, to understand this particular equation. It's the book that really brought this to the world. Because before this book was written, we thought about things, even developmental psychology was thought of in Freudian terms, in Jungian terms, in the psychoanalytic tradition, the psychodynamic tradition. Bowlby and Ainsworth had written their famous treatise on attachment theory, but it was never solidified in this way. But great book that was written that really brought childhood to the forefront and helped us transition from a clinical understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder to understanding that trauma can be incredibly complex, and that even if the event that sets off the trauma is not life-threatening, a kid waiting on the side of the street for mom for 2 hours, he's not going to die, but in his mind he's already dead because
Yeah.
his mother has disappeared and he has no means to explain if she's coming or not. In fact, he probably believes that she isn't. His world has collapsed. If you are that 4-year-old kid, I know it's been a minute for you and I, Rick, but if you are that 4-year-old, your world has collapsed, right? And there is nothing more damaging than for someone to come along and say, no, you're not allowed to feel that way. You're not allowed to be upset or hurt or distressed. In fact, if you're hurt, upset, or distressed, I'm going to make you more hurt, more upset, and more distressed until you go numb. I have a very good friend, actually, who is a professional colleague, who told me that when she was a kid and she used to be beaten by her father, who was an army general, not in this country, she's from a different country, I won't say from where, but she's from a part of the world that still allows fathers to beat their children to within an inch of their lives. And her father used to hit her with this stick. And she told me, she says, it used to get to a point where she would just go numb and she would just lie on the floor or the couch or wherever she was, and he would just be hitting her harder and harder and harder, and she wouldn't feel anything. And that's really what Charcot observed and what we see. And that is where, when we put children in so much distress that they can't cope with it, what they do is they tune out, they check out.
Right. Right.
Right. And so there is this very interesting argument, because one of the things that is, this is a controversial subject, and sadly I don't know enough about this to really take a definitive position, but it's the multitudes of children we have in the first world whom we're treating with very powerful drugs for things like attention deficit. We have to ask ourselves, are these kids, have we suddenly discovered a condition in the last 10, 15 years that never previously, suddenly we have tons and tons of kids who can't concentrate? Or are they just tuning out because there's something about the world in which they inhabit that they find distressing?
Right.
I think
Good
it's a
question.
question worth asking, don't you?
Absolutely.
That's a
I
really
wish I,
tough question, actually. Yeah, it really
yeah.
is.
I
You
mean,
know,
all these kids that can't focus, are they just all tuned out? Because when I see it in adults, I certainly there's very little difference between the two. And very often, when I probe deeper with people who come to me who've been psychometrically diagnosed, as in other words, they've done psychological testing and they fit all the criteria, and sure enough, reduce the distress, and suddenly the brain switches on. They're not attention deficit. But I want to be very careful. I don't want to lay claim to knowledge that I don't have, or that I'm not certain of. I just want to put that as a question rather than say that all attention deficit is dissociation by definition. I don't know that. There are people who will say that, but I'm afraid looking at the evidence, I can't agree with them. Not 100%.
But it is a good question. Like, and I think there's a there was a great TED talk. I think it was Sean Acorn was the guy that put the TED talk together. But he talked about, researchers, they put these wonderful graphs together, but they also have these, when you're putting all the data together, you have all these outliers, right?
Mm,
They're never interested in them. They're only interested in the normal line, and there was a movie or a documentary, Medicating Normal, right? So if you take
yeah,
the consensus, most people act this way, but you're not. You're outside here. So what can we do about that? It's like, rather than
mm,
understanding what puts them out there, we want to medicate them so that they kind of
yeah,
fit in the spectrum, right? It, but not to like I like what you're saying about holding on to the positions and just being
mm,
curious about it and asking questions.
right,
Like, just keep asking
yeah,
questions. And I think, like, why is that? Why is that
yeah.
way? You know, and
Yeah,
and
and I think a solution to it as well is, and this is where I find literature and music, and the arts a great place, because it's an expression of human suffering, if it's anything really,
yeah,
or joy, or but a lot of it is suffering. If you're interested in human suffering, there's no shortage of people to read. There really isn't, as I am.
or country music, or
Uh,
if
I'm thinking of one particular song. I believe the title of the song is Riders on the Storm, and it was written by The
right,
Doors, Jim Morrison. And there's a
yes,
line in that song that goes, "Let your children play." I think
mm,
that's the answer. I
absolutely,
think the answer is if you, I mean, I saw this when I was working in the criminal justice system, and I was asked to develop a program for kids who had behavioral problems, who'd fallen afoul of the law, but they hadn't got sucked into gangs and things like that. So there was a good chance that we could do something with them. I remember the colleagues that I brought on board were all people, especially my number two, a very good friend of mine called Rosie, all experiential therapists, because I remember thinking to myself, having read the research, that if we get these kids who are severely traumatized, all of whom have a diagnosis of ADHD, you don't have to believe the link between ADHD and trauma. All you have to know is, if you take these kids who can't concentrate, who can't sit down and focus, who get extremely frustrated if you make them, you don't have to agree on the cause of it. But if you
hmm
accept that that's really what you're dealing with, then taking 30 boys and forcing them to sit at a desk for an hour, 2 hours, or whatever, you're not going to get anywhere with them, really.
right,
They
yep,
need to be moving around, they need to be painting and drawing. And the funny thing was, when we did that with them, oh my God, you should have seen the stuff that they came up with. But you force them to sit in a circle and do ordinary group therapy, you don't get a word out of them. They're all looking out the window. I had to learn the painful way. But
yeah,
yeah,
no,
no, I agree with you. It's a very, and I think that the answer to that is, let these kids play. Just let them play.
But one of the things that I learned in my own personal experience parenting my kids, one big shift that I made, and this was actually through the guidance of a therapist, was
Yeah,
to really help them process the trauma in the moment, and myself not get caught in the, oh my God, I traumatized my kids because I just lost it and now they're going to be traumatized for life, right? But
yeah,
instead, really acknowledging what's going on, acknowledging their feelings, helping them feel
yeah,
the painful experience, and like helping them
yeah,
process. Because really, what trauma
yeah,
is, the event is gone and it's done, right? But what trauma
exactly.
really
Yeah,
is we're holding on inside of ourselves about it, right? And so if you help your
yeah,
children process as you go, truthfully, there's no traumatic experience that's going to, like stay within them if you have done the
yeah.
work of process. So I
Well,
found
that's
that
that's a
like it was, go ahead, sorry.
yeah, that's a beautiful example, and you really very nicely uh, expand on the point that Rick began earlier when he very accurately observed that look, it can't be the event, it can't be the job because stress is freaking everywhere. Stress is absolutely everywhere. It can't be that. And to go back to a great psychologist who crafted the term good enough mothering. Why did he just say good mother? Because Donald Winnicott, great American psychologist, recognized that the term good mother is an anachronism. All mothers make mistakes. That's just being human.
Mhm.
Show me a mother who's never made a mistake, and I'll show you a woman who isn't a mother. I mean, it's just,
Right.
it's crazy to think that mothers don't make mistakes and that they should be guilty. Of course, mothers are going to make mistakes, but as Rick very succinctly pointed out, the problem is not the event. Trauma is not what happens to us. As you said, it's the child's capacity to respond to whatever happened. And the best thing that a parent can do is to say to them, when this bad thing happens to you and you feel really rotten inside, you can do two things. You can hold it in. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do two things. One is I'm going to create the space for you to express how you're feeling. And even if that's anger or, you know, anxiety or any kind of negative affect, you know what? That's absolutely fine. I'm going to do that, number one. And number two, I'm going to show you that I do that.
Right.
That I,
No,
as your mum, that when I'm hurt, when I'm distressed, when I'm angry, I don't hold it in. I
right.
express it. And the most powerful way you can teach your children is through modeling. We know that.
Right.
And you're
Modeling.
doing both. So,
Right.
very good therapist, whoever he or she was.
Yeah, it was groundbreaking. It was definitely a huge shift for me because, yeah, I found myself really getting in the worry and the fear of I traumatized them, and now what are we gonna do? And like really feeling that was like once you have it, you can't overcome it. So yeah, I mean, it was a few years ago, but it makes so much sense. Anyway,
Yeah.
as we are coming to the end of this, I was wondering if there was any last words that you wanted to leave our audience with, if there's anything that we should have asked you that you would like to speak to. I'm gonna put all your links and in the chat so people can reach you directly through there.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead if there's anything you would like to share or point to.
Well, I think I would really, you know, the last thing that I would say is to summarize what we've been saying. If something really rotten has happened to you in your life, something really, really rotten, or it may not be one thing, it may be a series of rotten things. The trauma may be complex. You may not have one really big thing. It may be a multiple of very small things, the essence of complexity that's happened over and over and over again. Maybe bullied. And you find that you have real difficulty concentrating, you have real difficulty uh, regulating your emotions, uh, your relationships really suffer. Um, you find you're extremely avoidant. You don't like, you crave human contact, but you don't go out, and you find yourself, excessively ruminating, you have very negative beliefs about yourself, and you have all kinds of ailments that you can't explain, it's a very good chance you have trauma. Pick up the phone and call someone, because you may think that you cannot be helped. But I'm here to say to anyone who thinks they have trauma, yes, you can be helped. You can be helped. And you will be surprised at your nervous system's capacity to heal. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Give it the chance. That would be my final thoughts, I think.
Love that. I love that we're leaving this really heavy topic on a positive note, right? It is possible to heal from this.
And
Absolutely,
that those words, give it a chance.
Give it a chance.
Give it a chance, yeah.
I like that, because we tend to look at the body that way, in the sense of we cut ourselves. Give it a chance to heal. Give it a chance to heal, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes here, maybe we should start using that word a little bit more too, or that phrase, hey, just give it a chance. Just give it a chance. I love it.
Yeah.
I just love our conversation, Reshie. I can't wait to actually delve into your book. Actually, I ordered it. I don't know what to say. Actually, I want you back.
A beginner's guide to, I will put it in
trauma.
Yeah.
Trauma. If anyone wants to.
No, I mean,
it's on Amazon.
You're saying everything. My key message, like, you're not broken. Like, give it a chance. Like, like what you're pointing to is something that is natural within us. Like you said, the nervous system is remarkable. And anyways, I could keep going. I could keep going. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for having me on your podcast and giving me the opportunity to speak to a stateside audience, a different audience. It's very much appreciated. Thank you both.
You're so welcome. I put here the title of the book in here. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate your very powerful conversation, and
thank you both.
Hope to have you on again. And everybody
else, it will be my pleasure.
We'll see you next week, same time, same place.
Subscribe, share this episode.
Find value in this episode, share it, and help us amplify our impact.
Yeah,
all right, everyone.
absolutely.
See you soon. Ciao.